So there's this one thing that 69% of managers are just terrified about. Do you guess what it is?
What?
So managers are actually terrified about communicating with their employees. And if you think about it, like communication is like such a natural, normal thing. What is there to it, right?
Yeah, that's true. Like when you think about communication, you think about basically talking.
Right.
But I think sometimes people forget that communication is more than that.
Right.
It also involves speaking with your body, with your expressions.
Right.
Also listening. Listening is a big part of communication that I think most people forget.
I think because communication seems so natural and having a conversation with people don't actually pause and ponder about how they're communicating, portraying themselves, or whether the message they're conveying even gets through to other people. And that's where I feel like a lot of times, like, things are lost and things are not done as efficiently as possible, more effectively as possible, and not in the most like conditioned way as possible.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, talking about efficiency and all, like, I feel like both of us are working professionals and we always think about communication in the workplace. Like maybe it's not always at the forefront of a thought, but at the back of the mind, the topic of communication in the workplace is so important. Like, I mean, just your thoughts. Why do you think it's important in the workplace?
I think one thing that most people don't really consciously think about is how communication affects their mental wellness. The way we choose to communicate is actually how people perceive us. And that actually influences the way we interact with people and basically the world that we live in. And it has very real consequences in terms of the way you choose to be, the way you interact with people. It actually influences the relationships, the quality of relationship that you have with people. And this is so important, thinking about it from a perspective of maybe, right now you're an employee and you have a manager above you, right? And how does that communication look like? How does that relationship look like? Or even your peers, your colleagues. Or even now, for example, in a managerial position, how do you interact with the people under you, right? And it's so much more, but people just say, I can talk, I can speak, let's just do it, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to take time to pause because it impacts people's lives, not just your own, but the people you interact with. I feel like sometimes, especially when you're in a position of manager role, means that there is more weight to your words, there's more weight given to you, and how you choose to communicate, there's a multiplication effect, right? It's your words are heavier and it's going to linger just a bit longer on people's life, and that's why we need to be intentional.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, I think I read this somewhere that communication style has a direct bearing on workplace culture.
Right.
Because you set the tone of your company with the way you communicate. Because that, like, communication is literally like it encapsulates your tone and everything. So the way you communicate with not just your employees, your colleagues, everyone, it sets the workplace culture.
Right, and not just the culture, but it sets the relationship that you have. And it just sets the interactions that you're going to be having with employees and what do you want to achieve. A lot of times people are wondering, this is the culture I don't like, this is the employees I don't like. But how many people actually stop and think that it could be because of the way I've established the culture, by the way I choose to communicate, right? And I think this is one lever that people actually have in their disposal that they can use that not many people are talking about today.
Okay, this reminds me of a story. So basically, this is a very random LinkedIn post that I read. Okay, so there was this one particular communication coach that was talking about her client. So basically, this particular client, he was facing issues in the workplace in terms of communication. Like he was not getting along with his employees. Like every interaction he had with his colleagues became sort of like a battle. Like it was so much of fighting back and forth. The colleagues felt like he's the one attacking them.
Right.
So they instantly went into defense mode. And this person felt that the colleagues don't understand them.
Right.
Right. And what the coach basically tried to make him realize was that there are so many factors that are playing into this. Like one of the factors was, okay, this was what she said. So physically, he was a big man, right? So every time he stood up and talked, it seemed intimidating to the person in front. Like he didn't realize that was a factor, right? He was always shocked that the person went into defense mode, but the person on the other side felt like he was being attacked.
Right.
So like in this way, body language plays such an important role, and also it really permanently affected his workplace relations.
I think what you've pointed out is so true. Because oftentimes, right, the intentions that we have when we're speaking is not the same as what people are receiving, right? It's not the same lens that we view it through. And so it's so hard for people to kind of have that self-reflection to realize what's going wrong. Why is that particular employee so defensive? It may seem like they are the one that are in the wrong. They are the one that's always having the problem, but sometimes we need to be introspective, kind of reflect on, is there a particular reason why? And I think you mentioned it really beautifully. It's about understanding, right? People didn't understand what was being communicated. And that's why communication is so important, right? That's it.
Yeah, definitely. Like not just that, right? There are so many other things. Like there can also be factors outside of work that are affecting your mental wellness, and that gets reflected in the workplace, right? So you need to be empathetic towards that also. Like, okay, I might be stressed because there's a situation at home,
Right.
and just might be that I lost my cool in work because that was weighing on my mind.
Right.
So in that particular situation, like that person would expect the receiver on the other side of the communication to be empathetic,
Right.
like, even though the person doesn't know what's happening, maybe just like just asking what went wrong and
Right.
communicating, it can really lead to resolutions.
I think it is amazing what you say, because like we say, we only can see from our perspective. It's almost like we have baggages, we have things that go on in life. There's so much more than work, right? But at the same time, when we enter into the workplace, everyone is coming with their own baggages, their own context of life that they're going through, and we can't see into that. I think some part of communication as well is taking the time to understand that another human being is involved, that they have their lives outside of work, they are interacting them with, and it takes the time to actually to pause, right? I always talk about this idea of being empathetic, right? And in communication, I feel like that's also very relevant, right? Giving people the benefit of the doubt, understanding that there's so much more to life than, for example, this task to be done, this deadline to be met, and showing that level of empathy, even in our communication, in the way we choose to articulate ourselves, right? Shows people that this is how my manager is, this is how the people that I work with are like, and I'm really glad that you brought that up.
I'm just curious, have you ever personally, or do you know of someone who's faced a poor communication situation?
Right. I think when we talk about communication and the challenges that come with it, one of the first things that comes to mind is, how do you correct somebody? Because that is something that's very unpleasant. And it must happen, because we are all learning, right? In our jobs, in our role, no matter how senior you are, there's always room for improvement. We can learn from the people above us, we can learn from the people beneath us, we can learn from experiences. But how do we correct someone? I feel like that's the most crucial point, especially when it comes to difficult conversations to be had. And I've learned over the years, in terms of many interactions, being corrected many times myself, I think it's very important to kind of separate the task or what happened with a person's identity, right? When we are communicating, speaking about actions in a way that is not inferring a person's identity, whether they are a good or bad employee or good or bad person, but what actually happened during the task. I was having this conversation over lunch with a very amazing entrepreneur in Singapore as well. He's doing a lot of crazy stuff with tech. And we were just having this conversation about how he led his team. And he shared with me this framework. I don't think he came up with it, but it really stuck with me. He called it the 3F framework, right? And the first thing he talked about was, what were the facts? Because facts is undeniable, right? What actually happened. We're not talking about emotions here, whether I'm frustrated, I'm angry, or what the other party feels like, but what actually happened. I think that's a very good lens, right? The unbiased lens to kind of view what happened. Facts. Second is to check in, with your employee, what's the feeling like? What's his emotions? Checking in to make sure that, yes, this person may have made a mistake, but he's still a human being, right? There's still room for improvement. It's not the end of the world. How are they doing, right? That's the human thing that we can do. And the last one is, what's the future like, right? The last F is, how can we now move forward? How can I help you so that we can move forward from this situation? I feel like, communicating with intention, right? And putting aside the emotions, because sometimes when we are frustrated, it's sometimes the worst possible time to have a communication and to have that emotions mixed with your communication. I think it's important, the moment we catch ourselves that I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling sad, is a time you shouldn't be speaking, right? You should take some time to pause and see really, how do I want to communicate this across? And then that's when we do it, right? It's going to be so much more impactful. And I can tell you, I've done this multiple times, and it's always been a much more stable, a much more effective way to communicate. And oftentimes it leads to way better results.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Like, this is basically essentially the importance of feedback, right?
Right.
Like, I had a friend face a similar situation too. Like, the manager at his workplace always gave negative feedback. Like, okay, if he did something good, positive feedback would never come to him. But negative feedback would be instant, and it would be really, really harsh, because even the manager didn't take the time to reflect and put it in a more pleasant way across.
Right.
So I feel like feedback is definitely, like, it's one of the duties of the manager, but the way it's delivered is so important. Like, it can really make or break an employee's confidence.
Right. I think, when people always talk about feedback, they miss the point that feedback need not be negative. It's not always about where can I improve, but what you've done great. There are positive feedback that can be given. If you think about it from this perspective, and I'm only correcting you whenever you make a mistake. You are raising a bunch of employees to only be people who avoid mistakes. You're not raising them to do good, to actually go to do actually better, to be creative, to be innovative, because you are just making them afraid of making mistakes, but not giving them the freedom, the empowerment, or even incentive to want to do and create, to innovate, right? And I think it's so important that we kind of have that balance. And I'd be mentioning about creating culture, and that's how we do it, right? By affirming the people when they have done well, by recognizing the efforts. When people feel like, they've been recognized, they've been seen, these are the kind of things that they will want to do more, and the things that the kind of traits that they want to exhibit. I think it's important we don't just correct the negative mistakes that people have been made, so reaffirm the positive things as well. I think that's amazing. Yeah.
That's definitely true. So just because you mentioned a framework,
Right.
this framework that I think I learned in school came to my mind. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Shannon-Weaver model.
Shannon
Weaver model.
Weaver model.
Yeah.
Might have heard of it, but remind me.
Okay. It's actually a very simple model. Okay, so basically, it was a mathematical model, but it was adopted to communication theories. But it's essentially very simple. But okay, so I'll tell you what it is. So, in a communication framework, there's a sender.
Right.
The sender is the one initiating the message. The message is basically the information the sender wants to pass on. The sender selects a channel to pass this information to the receiver, and the receiver is the one who's supposed to understand the message.
Right.
And the receiver is also supposed to give feedback to the sender about the information that he has received.
Right.
So even though it's such a simple model, I feel like it can have so much insights about communication planning.
Right.
I feel like it's a simple framework that someone who's about to communicate can think about. Like, for example, if I'm a manager and I want to communicate new deadlines to the team, right? I will think about the message. The message has to be clear and concise because this is a very important thing. The deadlines have to be clearly highlighted. So I've thought about it. I'm going to then decide on the channel. So maybe I should go with an email, because if it's a video call, there can be noise, there can be disturbances.
Right.
Maybe the connection is bad or whatever. So I decide on sending it via an email. So the email is sent, and then when the receiver, who are the employees in this case, or the team members, when they receive it, they're supposed to understand it and report back that, okay, we've understood that there are new deadlines. So even such a simple model can really help with planning your communication on like a day-to-day basis, because it makes you stop and introspect as to what the ideal way to send the message is. Should it be clear and concise? Should it be very explanatory? What is the best channel so that there is no noise, like no disturbance, no problems in the communication, right? So
I love that model. I think one thing, is when we recognize that there could potentially be noise in the communication. I think that's something that a lot of people fail to see. When we have that conversation, we believe that everything from my mind goes straight into yours and you understand completely what I'm trying to talk about. But recognizing that there could be potential noise, maybe, for example, different contexts when we're speaking, different backgrounds. And then, a lot of time could be wasted because of miscommunication, work get done that, it's not up to standard, or maybe even on completely different contexts, right? And it's so important to recognize that, there could be potential noise, there could be a miscommunication, right? And then what can I do to prevent that? I think a lot of times, we expect the other party to kind of reaffirm that they understood. And most of the time, people in their mind, they'll think, I got it, like, I've heard you. But I think it's important, right, for you to feel like there's potential for noise. And this communication, it's something that's important. I'm not asking you where we go for lunch, for example. If there's weight behind it, there are consequences behind it. It's so important, right, at the start, to make sure that, we always mention this word in corporate, whether are we aligned, right? Do we actually understand what you're trying to bring across? And it's important for both parties, right, to clarify when there's doubt. And when there's potential for doubt, it's important for the one that's communicating to clarify, do you understand what I mean? Clarify the points that could potentially be confounders, things that people don't really get or maybe misunderstand. And I really love this very simple, very practical way to communicate. And, sometimes using multiple channels may be great as well, following up the email, right, to show. I love that you say that because, different channels have different strengths. Right?
Yeah.
And, it's always good to have written down. So so many things can happen in a day, right? How are we choosing our communication channel? Imagine I'm having a meeting with you at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. in the evening. It's going to be hard, right? To remember all the context of what was discussed. So these are just many ways that we can be conscious of And all of a sudden, we can be practical, right? When we choose to communicate with the people around us. Yeah.
Like that, there's one other thing that I really like about this model also is the fact that it also talks about the receiver. So it's not just like communication is a two-way process, right? It's not just on the sender to send the message in the best possible way, but it's also on the receiver to understand and interpret it, because the noise can be from the sender's point of view or from the receiver's point of view, right? Like you've sent the email, this email has gone through, but as the receiver, while I'm reading the emails, there's like TV or Netflix blasting in the background.
Right.
So I'm just passively reading the email, not registering its content. So I really like the fact that this model puts onus of communication on both the parties, not just one way.
Right. I think, as you were mentioning that, I've thought of many like examples of these type of things that have happened in real life. So I had a colleague of mine, not really a colleague, sort of a manager of mine, who's like a close friend. And one thing that I really love is that when he was sending out, work and checking in on me, he made it clear that he was checking in on me to find out how I was doing and not checking in on whether I finished the task. And just that clarification gave me ease, because I know that, okay, he's not pressurizing. I need this by 5 p.m. End of day, I need this by 6. Right? He's telling me I'm just checking on you, making sure that you're able to finish the task, like do at it, work on it, continue to work on it. And then just that clarification make it so much easier, because I could have interpreted it as I need it by the end of the day. Even though he did not explicitly say that, him checking on it creates that sense of maybe this is urgent, but he could see that, right? He could see that his message could be misunderstood, right? And it's going to be difficult for me to clarify. Do you mean that it's urgent? Is this, yeah? So he acknowledged that, okay, I can potentially cause stress to other people, right? How can I word this more carefully, right? So that I don't actually put pressure on other people on things that are not urgent. I feel like a lot of times, because of the way we choose to communicate, everything seems urgent. Everything seems like I need it now. I need it yesterday, right? But there are things that are priority. There are things that, so that we can actually leave space for the things that are really important, the things that are really urgent. Let's make sure that when we communicate, we really bring that across.
Definitely.
Yeah, I feel like it's about the story of the body quite wolf. When we're constantly saying that everything is urgent, nothing is urgent. Nothing can be done in a way that's urgent. Yeah, and that comes back down to communication again.
Yeah.
Right.
That's essentially I think essentially what you're trying to say is that communication facilitates clarity, clarity, transparency, whatever. I mean, if your expectations are clearly defined, you are more likely to feel less stressed, right? Because you know what's expected of you. So you're gonna do that, and then you'll also be motivated to go beyond.
Right. I think one thing that is also has to be mentioned is, now for quite a bit we've been talking about from a managerial standpoint, how to create spaces that are less stressful. But I think on the flip side as well, right, from an employee standpoint, how can we practically do that? And one aspect I was actually talking about is setting expectations. I know this is like setting or managing expectations. I think this is a word that's been thrown around quite a bit, right? It also talks about how can we be clear on what is feasible, what is doable, right? I think it's important as well we communicate upwards, not just communication downwards in an organization, but how can we communicate upwards to let people know we're being accountable. We're not creating false promises or false illusions. We're being clear, right? And I think it also takes bonus, right, to tell people what can be done and what's not feasible. But having that communication, I feel like it's about how can we set the relationship such that people are comfortable with voicing out what's doable, what's not doable. And we create an environment that is very practical, is very safe, and it's for the agenda. Can we, at the end of the day, all of us here, have families, have things, have so much more than just work. How can we create that this segment of life is as efficient as possible, as enjoyable as possible? Yeah.
That is so true. I don't think I've ever thought about that point, that, just because, okay, as people who are starting out work, we're so tempted to say, oh yeah, we can get everything done. We can get everything done. I think the real good employee is the one who says, okay, this can actually be done and I'm going to do it. But this is something which is unreasonable, or maybe it's impossible to do it in the time that you've given me to do. And I think, I think that was a very good point.
I love that we are talking about communication, because it's something that's so natural. As a child growing up, communication is one of the very first things you learn. You learn to walk, you learn to speak, right? And right now we're relearning it, right? In terms of not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of my life. How are you choosing to communicate? And you were just talking about how managing expectations and the two-way of communication. I think one thing that's interesting is when we're communicating, it's always about how do we choose to respond as well. Because we've been talking about one-sided way, setting expectations or communicating. But now I want to talk a bit about responding. How can we choose to respond to people? I think it's so important because, for example, employee sets expectation if you're telling them this is not feasible, and we choose to respond in a way that's very harsh, right, overly harsh, or telling them that no, this is your problem, go figure it out. And I have seen managers like that. I have experienced managers like that, and it's a really unhealthy feeling, right? You know that your managers don't get your back, right? And you would think about it like from that perspective onwards. Right now, when would I be afraid, right? Would I be afraid to then tell you what's feasible, what's not feasible? And at the end of the day, when it's really not feasible, the work doesn't get done. Even though, and you see, there's a lot of miscommunication just because, right, on how we choose to respond to literal cries of help, if you will, right? So I think it's so important that we are being very careful in the way we choose to, speak, but also be very careful in the way we choose to respond. I'm not saying that you have to like pause and consider every conversation really carefully before you speak, but I think it's really important from now onwards to kind of just bear in mind, like, how am I speaking? How am I responding? And is there an impact of the way I choose to respond? I think being conscious of that will make you communicate a lot more effectively and a lot more intentional with what you hope to achieve.
Basically, like negative attitudes like ego, anger, they don't have a place in communication.
Right.
Right? Like you, like you said before, right? You shouldn't respond when you're angry, or you shouldn't respond from a place of being egoistic. Like, oh, I'm the manager and I said something. How can you say no to me?
Yes.
Like, that's not how good communication is established. That's not good. That's not going to do good to you or the employee or the company in general.
Right. I think at the end of the day, always must be an alignment in terms of what they hope to achieve. Right. I think most employees want to do good. Right. I mean, there are obviously going to be outliers, but large majority of employees, large majority of managers as well want to do good for the company, for themselves. Right. And I think most people are seeking success. I don't think that many people are seeking failures, right? And I think acknowledging that both of you are in the same boat. Yeah, it's not a conflict where one wins and one loses, but it's thinking about how can we work together to achieve that particular goal, right? I think that's the nature of communication. That's the nature of collaboration, and a very large aspect of work itself. Like you're literally coming together, different aspects, different experiences coming together for a common goal, for a common agenda, and communicating is just how can we do it together effectively. Yeah.
Okay, you're a leader yourself, right? You're a manager yourself. So, any tips that you have to improve communication? Maybe, or just something that you practice. Doesn't have to be like tips of something that you practice in order to ensure good communication in the organization you manage.
I think for me, one of the biggest aspects of being a leader is how can I make sure that people are comfortable with speaking their mind, right? I think, the moment, right, we create an environment where it's not conducive for people to speak their thoughts, their opinions. What I'm basically saying is that I'm right and you are wrong. There's no other opinion that's correct because no one is going to be bold enough to constantly challenge you. Maybe for the first time, the second time, but if you're constantly shooting down ideas, if you're constantly saying no, that's bad, if you're constantly criticizing people, no one else will speak up, right? And how can I create an environment where people are comfortable with speaking up, right? Where people are acknowledged when they speak up. It creates an environment that allows people to grow. Not just them, the people around me get to grow, but myself, I'm learning from the people that I interact with because they're comfortable speaking up. I think like for any managers who are listening to our podcast, I think one of the biggest aspects is understanding that the way you choose to communicate sets the culture, sets the relationships, and it sets the quality of the work that you're putting out. Do you really want to be the smartest person in your room? Right? But having that conversation, creating spaces and making people comfortable with speaking, you set a relationship where people are willing to do anything, right? To see you succeed because they know that you have their back as well. Can you create an environment? Be conscious of how you speak. Yeah.
That's so true. It reminds me of a quote. Okay, I know some famous entrepreneur said it, but I don't know who said it. It's like, I think it somewhat goes like, I don't want to be like, if I'm running a company where I'm the smartest person in the room, then I'm doing it wrong.
Right. I think that's something that really encapsulates what I believe. I believe that everyone has the potential. Everyone has knowledge, different expertise. That's why we are working together. They have already proven themselves. They already have something to bring to the table. And I want to hear what it is.
That's so true. I feel like this also makes me think of another thing. Like, never expect the people you're communicating with, whether it's your employees or anybody else, to read your mind. Like, don't under communicate. Also, don't over communicate. Don't keep repeating the same thing again and again and again, so that the person in front is zoning out and stops listening to you. But also, don't under communicate. don't give vague responses to questions. Don't set goals and expectations that are like vague and subjective. I think under communication, or this idea that, oh, you should understand what I'm saying, is also like problematic.
Right. I think one thing that I've seen in real life that's been very helpful is when managers actually take the time to ask, right? Take the time to ask for feedback. I think that's, as a manager standpoint, you're always like, I got feedback for you, I got feedback for you, you get a feedback, right? But it takes time, and it takes humility for a manager to ask, like, am I communicating well, right? Is there room for me to improve, right? And oftentimes, when we create that safe space for people to speak up, that's when you hear the real facts. You realize that, actually, perhaps, I could give a bit more clarity, or perhaps, she or he is new, perhaps I could share a bit more details or explain the why behind what we're doing, right? I think that comes from taking the position of humility, asking actively for feedback. And once you've created that safe space, feedback does come. Yeah, and that's where you grow as well, right?
That's very true.